morning. Good morning, or whatever time of day it is in the place and time where you are listening to this. It's a pleasure for me to connect with you this morning, even if it is remotely. I pray for the day when we can all be together again in one place. Reverend Sheila asked me this morning to talk to you about the power of story. And being the congenial person that I am, I said, no, I don't want to talk about the power of story. I just want to tell you a story. So I'm doing the grown-up story this morning. Once upon a time, and you know all true stories begin that way, there was a monastery, a Buddhist monastery in Tibet. And like most Buddhist monasteries, it had a great statue of the Buddha in it. But this statue in this monastery was really ugly. It was coarsely made of clay. It was old and crumbly. But the monks in the monastery venerated this statue. They considered it to be the most precious statue of the Buddha. Well, one day, a new young monk joined the monastery. He learned his rituals and prayers, but like all the other monks, but he could never understand why they venerated this ugly statue. He was a very devout young man, and he thought the statue was unworthy of the great Buddha. So he went to the head monk and he said, "Why are we venerating this ugly statue?" And the head monk didn't give him a very good answer. He just said, "We have always been taught that it is the most precious statue, and you should not question ancient wisdom." Well, the young monk wasn't very satisfied with that answer. So whenever he kneeled or prayed in the presence of the Buddha, he would look at it and he'd think, oh, there are hundreds of better statues of the Buddha in the markets. I myself could make a better statue of the Buddha. But every time he pleaded with the old monk wouldn't listen. So one day, as happens to all of us, the old monk died. And after a suitable period of mourning, the young monk went to the new head monk and he said, "Now, can we replace this statue of the Buddha?" The head monk said, "We have always been taught that it is precious, and out of respect for our dear departed one, we must continue to revere it." Well, the monk was pretty much fed up with this nonsense. And one night when he couldn't sleep anymore for thinking about the ugliness and the unworthiness of the statue, he got up and he stole out of the room to the chamber where the statue was kept with a hammer in his hand. He was thinking, if I damage that statue, they will have to replace it. So he took his hammer and he swung and crack the belly of the Buddha. All the monks woke up. They heard the noise and they went running from their beds to hear what the sound was. And there they saw the young monk looking very guilty with the sledgehammer in his hand. But the head monk said nothing. He went up to the statue of the Buddha with his torch to look and examine the crack. And out of the crack, a gleam of light shone. He turned to the young monk and he said, "Go ahead. Finish the job." So the young monk took the hammer and kind of warily and timidly started chipping away at the statue, and the clay fell away and the plaster fell away. And when he was finished, there stood a great gleaming golden statue of the Buddha. Solid gold, priceless. And the monks stood in awe. They had no idea of the wealth that they possessed. Now, if that were the end of the story, we could talk about how this is a parable of religion, how sometimes the true meaning, the spiritual heart of a religion is forgotten and lost over time. Just like the beautiful, mystical Gospel of Thomas, which we heard a little piece of today. More than a millennium ago, when the early Christian fathers were burning the Gospels that didn't conform to their orthodox thinking, a group of Christian monks thought this book was so precious that they hid it in a clay pot in a cave in the desert of Egypt. And there it stayed for hundreds of years until less than 100 years ago, 1945, it was discovered. It is golden, and we should examine it more closely. But that's not the end of the story, because the young monk was still curious. Now he understood why the monks had venerated the statue, but he couldn't understand why something so precious and valuable had been covered in clay and forgotten. So he went to the monastery library, and he looked and he read through all the papers until he found the story. The story was that centuries before, during a time of war, when the monastery was under siege, the monks were afraid that their golden Buddha would be stolen if the monastery fell into enemy hands. And so they covered it quickly in clay. And then when the siege was over, they decided that something so valuable was always vulnerable to plunder. And so they decided to leave it covered in clay. And they taught the young monks that came after them to venerate it. They taught them that it was precious. But over time, the gold underneath was forgotten. Now that's the end of the story. And like all stories, it can be seen as a parable on many levels. But I don't want to talk about the religious level this morning. I want to talk about the personal level. What does this story teach us about ourselves? Here's my message. You are that golden statue. I am that golden statue. And I know you probably find that difficult to believe. I have trouble believing it myself. It's not what my inner voice tells me. My inner voice says to me, who do you think you are getting up in front of people preaching to them? You probably have an inner critic like that you have to do battle with all the time. Or maybe you're the kind of person who gets up and says, I am the greatest. Well, that's just very often covering insecurity and fear as well. It's a kind of shallow clay. I'm talking about a deeper, purer gold. Something buried so deep it's difficult to discover. Let me give you an example. Have you ever been at the birth of a baby? Maybe you were there as a witness, as the father, or maybe you attended as the nurse or doctor or the midwife or the doula, or maybe you were the one giving birth yourself. But when that newborn baby came into the world and you heard its first cry, did you not think you were present at a miracle? That baby was solid gold, and you were that baby once. So what happened to you? Well, maybe when you were a child, someone told you you weren't good enough, or someone said you were a bad child, and it hurt, and you covered yourself with clay to protect yourself. Or maybe when you went to school, the other children teased you or bullied you, and it hurt, and you covered yourself with more clay. That's what I think Jesus was talking about when he said, about the little children. Oh, first I meant to say, if you can remember this, there is nothing as vulnerable as the heart of a child. And that's what I think Jesus meant when he said, it is to such as these that the kingdom of heaven belongs. It is our true treasure, our innate human dignity and worth, our soul, if you will. Something so precious, we have to protect it, so we cover it with clay. But sometimes we go too far and we harden our hearts and we forget the gold underneath. But then something happens one day. Something so terrible that your heart is broken. Maybe someone you love dies. Maybe someone you love betrays you. You're getting a divorce. You just lost a job you've loved. You realize again how frail and vulnerable you are. And something cracks open in you, and you want to reach for that clay to patch yourself up. Whatever that clay is for you today, food, drink, drugs, shopping, work, whatever it is you use to cover that pain. But maybe you should stop and examine that crack more closely. You've probably all heard the words of Leonard Cohen's song Anthem. The chorus goes like this. Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. The old monk stands before the statue and shines his torch in, and light is reflected back. He says, go ahead. Break it open. Crack it all apart. And the chips of clay fall apart. And we feel as though our heart will break again. But it is the beginning of understanding who we truly are. We are more precious than words can say. We are loved by God. We are golden. Amen.